So Peter Newall, have you got your slides here? Yes. Is talking to us about limits of acceptable change, which is a concept which has been talked about a lot. If you're looking at trying to manage a site and avoid adverse change, what's a limit of change? What's the significance of change? And there's been a lot of work done on this, but I'm not sure where Peter's going on it, what the current thing is, so I'm really pleased to you to tell us. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Max. Like others before me, I acknowledge the traditional owners, and I'm thankful for the welcome to Yorta Yorta country. I'll start off with saying that Lance asked me to give a talk on limits of acceptable change, just essentially a quick and dirty. And he also told me I had 15 minutes. I've noticed on the thing I've got 25, so you'll understand if I talk slowly, I guess. Although now I can't. So yeah, it's really the what, why and how, and it's just a really quick rundown on how to approach doing limits of acceptable change and some of the issues that you're going to come up with when you have a go. So following on from Lance's presentation, once you've characterised your site and you've determined what criteria it meets and the components, processes and services benefits, eventually you're going to have to say, how do I know if the site still meets these criteria? You know, has it extended beyond what the criteria are? Has it fallen below? So how do I know what is still being met? That's how. Limits of acceptable change. So what are they? Well, I didn't know I did that. So first of all, they're thresholds. So they're hard lines in the sand where if you cross over, you have changed the ecological character of the site as determined during your RIS and ECD processes. Second, they're quantitative. They're a number, so there's not something fuzzy about it. Thirdly, they're based on the ecological character as described in your ECD. And finally, the Ramsar definition requires quantitative limits, thresholds for detecting change in ecological character of a wetland, and these can be components, processes, benefits and services. And as I think Max might have mentioned earlier, there's the components are typically the living things or aspects like the landforms and so forth. So they're tangibles, whereas the processes are things that are happening. So nutrient cycling or active hydrology that's supporting your components. And you've also got benefits and services, things like regulating water control, so, reducing floods, increasing sort of permanence of water where, downstream, so those sorts of things. And all of those can have some form of limit of acceptable change put on them if deemed necessary. Come on. So that's the how. That's the what, and the why is that it's really important. You need to know where you. By setting the limits of acceptable change, you start to ask where I am, and you need to know that. It makes you think about the things that could impact on the ecological character and whether you're approaching a limit. So things like threats. But you also need to look up available data, and you need to look at that data and say, does it really tell me what I need to know? Because often some of these criteria can be set without a whole lot of information behind it. And so you might start to think about monitoring needs. And so that can help you with your management of the wetland. Another thing it makes you think about are management triggers. Now, these are things that they're a point before the limit of acceptable change, at which point you go, okay, we're heading in a bad direction. I need to take action now so that we don't get to the limit. So the point is of the LACs is to not get to them. So you need to have a trigger that sparks management action beforehand. And the other reason is if you're going to go for a Ramsar site, it's a requirement to put in the LACs. So basically, how to do the listing criteria, how to do the limits of acceptable changes to start with the listing criteria. So you might have a rare plant species, you might have a wetland type that's representative of the region, and you'll know, hopefully you'll have some idea of how many there are or how many hectares there are that you're looking after. So you can use that as the basis of your LACs. So you identify the components of each criterion, and then you can also identify the processes that are important for those components. So if you've got a species that requires inundation 3 years out of 5 and you know where it is, then the process of hydrology is an important process, and you can put that in under an LAC as well. So requires this amount of inundation every 5 years, another amount after every 10 years, and so forth. So how an example for a wetland that Lance and I worked on, Little Waterhouse Lake in northeast Tassie. It's got a range of habitats, as you can see. We were lucky to have that site. I suppose most of the sites that we've worked on we've been really lucky to see and work in. So you've got open water, you've got floating leaved emergent vegetation, swamplands here or marshlands. So quite a range of habitats there. And to try and work out, starting from the bottom, it's counterintuitive, but say the criteria, I'll look at 2 that are relevant to Winton wetlands. One is supporting representative wetland types, criterion number 1, and then you start to look at what is important for that. So it's the wetland vegetation habitat type that supports the representative wetland type. And then there are other aspects up higher. We didn't go into those when we did the LACs because they were all pretty stable and there was nothing really that seemed to concern. And the bottom line was the actual criterion itself. The second one was supporting populations of threatened species that was listed, and it was the green and gold frog, which is the Tasmanian term for the growling grass frog. Or maybe ours is the Victorian term for the green and gold frog. So using both of those as an example of how we went about it, first of all, under the criterion 1, supports representative wetland types. Plant species diversity was identified as important, and to find this out, obviously there's a lot of literature you have to do, and I should say at this stage, be aware of, if you're going to do limits of acceptable change, the state agencies have so much knowledge and information that is often hidden and really good to work with. You know, we've found that in a lot of the states. The state departments are, often you don't realise how much information they've got and how useful they are. So anyway, we've got some recent surveys from some of the Pipwe people in Tassie, and combined they had found 45 different wetland plant species in that fairly small area. And so the process we went about in discussions with the state people was saying, okay, if you go out and do a single survey of the site, you'd hope to get at least about 80% of those species. So the limit of acceptable change was set at 36, which is 80% of 45. And the way that there's a format that we had to use under what was then DUHA, what's the name of the department now? DECA? DECWU?
Climate Change, Energy, Environment, Water, DQ.
Okay, DQ. Okay. Anyway, so it's now their document. It's from 2012, I think, that we were using it. And so we had to do the tabulation. So that you list the critical component, the baseline condition, 45 wetland plant species, the limit of acceptable change, the 36. And so you just tabulate it that way, and that's the way you put it into your ecological character description, assuming we keep doing ecological character descriptions. And because these were good botanists that had done the work, we had a high confidence or medium to high confidence that 36 was a useful number, 80% of what they had found. And then looking at the other one that I was talking about, the green and gold frog, recent surveys identified the presence. That's all we had. So it makes it hard to come up with some sort of a percentile. So with no quantitative data, I've written there no quantitative LAC, but in a sense, the quantity is 1. If it's present, then that's good. And again, doing the same sort of tabulation, we went through the process, and no quantitative information, therefore can't do a quantitative. And the confidence is low because we've had a report of it being there. And so, you know, when you go to assess whether you're or not you're meeting the LACs, this will come into play. And when I was saying that they're hard thresholds and they're exact numbers, there is going to be room for logic, you know, and a bit of being rational. And so the issues that we've come up with, lack of data, particularly important for variability, and perhaps less so at Little Waterhouse Lake, but at some of the sites on the Murray, when it's in drought and when it's in flood are really different situations, as we've seen La Nina and El Nino. So you need a lot of data to cover a whole range of hydrological events, a whole lot of weather events, you know, drying periods. Also the age of the data, some of them are at time of listing, and that's important because that's what it was listed for, and you need to know whether it's changed since then. But you don't know, and I think Peter Gell might start talking about what goes before listing, long before listing. But also what's happening now. If you've only got the data from the time of listing, it's really hard to determine whether it's changing. You can't even look at management triggers, let alone limits of acceptable change. And another issue is trajectories, and there are all sorts, of course. I did a chapter on LACs for the book that Peter and Max and others edited, and one of the guys I was doing it with had an issue where cane toads were coming in to a Ramsar site that he had been doing an ECD for, and there was just, it was there, it commenced prior to listing, but it was getting worse. And so you need to accommodate these when you evaluate the LACs because you can't stop it. You know, and a similar thing, one of the places that Ringarooma that Lance and I worked on, it was a floodplain estuary, beautiful site. Upstream in the 1800s, they'd been mining tin, and of course in the 1800s they didn't care what sort of sediment went into the stream. And this big sediment slug was working its way down the stream, and it had got to the floodplain, and in fact it created quite a variety of habitats on the floodplain that may not have been there because you're getting all these hummocks and hollows, and eventually what's going to happen is that as the sediment goes over the channels, it'll form these levees and it'll cut the floodplain off. And so it's going to go, but it's not something that's due to mismanagement since listing or even immediately prior to listing. It's an event that's going to happen. And you think about opening the Gippsland Lakes entrance. So you're getting salinity going in there at a higher rate than what it should, and it's changing. And that has been going on since prior to listing. So there are these trajectories that you can't change. And another one going down, global climate change, not just rising sea levels and their impacts on estuaries or mangrove stands, whatever. It's also things like if we get a lot less rain, if we have a whole lot more El Nino events and La Nina, as they're saying, we're going to get less and less of the years in between. What's this going to mean, this trajectory for our LACs? And there is a possibility of revising these LACs when it's beyond control. Max will know more about that than I do, but I just know that you can. I haven't approached that yet, and it'd be nice if we don't need to, but so you've got to realise that we may have to change LACs as the world catches up with us. Yes.
Use the microphone.
Someone's getting their 10,000 steps today.
I could have given you mine.
I think this follows on straight after the issue that you raised right at the end around climate change. And my question is related to significant events that are related to climate change that at this point in time probably aren't going to become a regular event. Say the significant flooding that occurred and it did catastrophic damage. It did catastrophic damage to some of those catchments in your rivers and your estuaries. So when you're going and looking at your LACs, do you then, because it totally changes that baseline, so you've got bank erosion, you've got all of those habitat change, do you then revise your LACs, or do you try and return your habitat to that baseline where you're looking and managing because you've assessed it to a certain point? Or do you then review and set new LACs based on the fact that it's changed beyond repair?
I would assume it's going to be very much a horses for courses, in the sense that if you're expecting these huge events occasionally as part of the wetland, then some of them will have a resilience to it. But that resilience may be waning as we get more and more of the very big dries and the very big wets. So I think it'd be a horses for courses thing. So you would work out whether you think it's going to be manageable to get back to what it was. Otherwise, I think you would need to revise your LACs.
Because I think that goes to what you're saying about the data use, that some of these significant rain events that have had big impacts are above and beyond the data that has existed. And I take Yea wetlands for an example. They've been closed because the damage to it from the flooding at the end of last year was so significant and it washed away boardwalk. So it's gone above and beyond. So then it's then looking at that, are these new levels? Is this our new high? Is this where we now then shift our data to say that this is a new extreme event that we can consider might happen again?
Yeah, I think up until now, in a lot of natural resource management, we've thought about climate change as being sort of steps, not huge leaps. And this is, I think it's uncharted territory, and so I really couldn't give a good answer for that. Yeah.
Sorry, I think it's an important issue, but there's several aspects to it. And from the Ramsar side, the Convention has not addressed climate change in terms of in how it impacts. They have started to look at carbon issues in wetlands, carbon storage, but haven't really looked at impacts. It's on the agenda now. But the other side is the impact of climate change on the Convention processes, which I think is part of your question, and that hasn't been looked at. It does need to be looked at. The Convention was written and developed before people were talking about human-induced climate change. But Peter Gell may talk about some of these past events and changes in the next presentation. But the other aspect of, in terms of the ecology of a lot of wetland systems and other systems, large episodic events are part of the ecology. And I don't think we've really addressed how we look at or manage around large episodic events. Climate change could, in certain places, make those a lot more common or worse. So it's a whole issue of Ramsar Convention processes or management processes, not just Ramsar, as well as understanding the ecology, because large episodic events can reset the ecological directories of wetlands naturally. Climate change makes it more complicated. Is there any more?
I completely agree with that. I think some of the systems we don't even actually know. We don't know what they're capable of recovering from. So that's why the monitoring aspect is so important, because we can, climate change is very uncertain exactly how it's going to unfold. But if we can monitor these systems, we can see over time what's possible for them. because, we do get these, massive flooding flows which could make a difference to the salinity at Lake Wellington, which we would have thought was just, something that couldn't be influenced.
Max just whispered. It's probably a good point to move on to Peter with.
I can give you a bag though.
Oh, yeah, a bag.
You have the bag.